This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. On today's program, we're going to take a multi-dimensional analysis on the coronavirus pandemic, what it means like in terms of the potential of biological spread, what it means in terms of economic impact, what it means in terms of like vaccinations and vaccinations slash microchip implants, IDs, electronic IDs, because all of those things ultimately flow together. So we have the coronavirus, suspending for a moment the origins of the coronavirus. We have a coronavirus spreading across the United States and across the world. And as you know, the coronavirus is completely interrupted just about every facet of life in the United States and other countries. People are isolated. People are isolated when they go outside, etc. So you have a complete instantaneous restructuring of the way our reality, the way our everyday life is. I mean, little things like instinctively shaking someone's hand after meeting or greeting them, etc. is you're not supposed to do that anymore. You don't do that anymore for fear of spreading germs. So it really has impacted us on the very microscopic social level as well as on the macro level. Now, here's what you don't see or hear being covered, being reported, or being analyzed by the mainstream media and many other media, which shows you that their analysis is shallow and one-dimensional versus multi-dimensional and having depth. So we hear semi-reporting, fictitious reporting, pretend wannabe reporting, which basically says, it's not good for people to be in isolation. Suicides go higher, divorces go higher, all kinds of. You take any social chaos indicator and it goes higher. So whether it's drug addiction, legal or illegal, whether it's alcoholism, domestic violence, murder, suicide, whatever, it all accelerates. Now, it all grows, but they're not really examining why it grows. It grows because our society to begin with was not a whole society. By a whole society, I mean, it's not basically a healthy society. It may be healthier than many societies, but it's not a healthy society, judging by, scientific statistical data on the depression rate in America is I think it's number one in the world. I could be wrong, but it's up there. It doesn't make any sense why it should be number one in the world. Teenagers are having an all-time epidemic with depression, etc. So there's all these psychological factors which are revealing the real inner state of pain, discontent, unhappiness that has been boiling under the surface in the United States for quite some time, for many generations. This was not true, by the way. Not that the world was some, Disneyland experience, but if you go back a number of generations, yeah, we had negative psychological data on people. Yes, absolutely, but nothing like it is today. See, in America, it's skyrocketed today. And what's also skyrocketed, and there's no way to ignore it, is the amount of time that people were already socially isolated and only virtually connected by using social media like Facebook and Google and Zoom and whatever the latest and the greatest is. Instagram, I mean, whatever it is. People were more interacting on that level and they were in the real human level. They were reacting virtually. Okay. And then people would edit, for example, what pictures they were going to put on Facebook or whatever. So our entire society was, in a sense, at least in Western societies like the European Union, and of course in many sophisticated nations in the Asian nations like Japan and certain areas of China and Taiwan, etc., and in certain South American countries, booming reliance on electronic social media versus a lack of priority being made towards true social interactions, which means physical face-to-face, looking at people, talking to people, shaking their hands, touching them, and I'm talking about patting them on the back or something. All that kind of behavior is not does not have the same priority. Many businesses were already incorporating things like Skype meetings and so on and so forth. So our world has been morphing before the coronavirus. People began to live in artificial like reality cocoons, talking to each other through social media outlets or fictitious personalities. You can join all these clubs and these, I don't even know what you call them, clubs, secret fantasy groups and stuff. Like you could be a knight or a princess or whatever, or a warrior, or you can take it as bad or as good as you want to take it, but you can live in an alternate world, a fantasy world. And people do all kinds of fantasies, not just sexual fantasies, romantic fantasies, adventurous, creative, artistic fantasy worlds, athletic fantasy worlds. You are in an Olympic swimmer or whatever. I mean, the possibilities are endless in the potential artificial lives you can live with artificial personalities that you create, artificial body, artificial face, and people these living in these very sophisticatedly done, highly using a great deal of imagination. People actually exist. They live a good segment of their lives through virtual personalities, through alternative personalities that they created, and then they live and inhabit and interact in some kind of virtual fantasy world that could involve all kinds of things. Not just weird things. It would monotonous, boring conversations you're having in your virtual world. I mean, it's staggering, and everybody can probably relate to this. You're having dinner or you're going to lunch with somebody, okay? Or they're coming over to your house or you're coming over to their house. And depending upon what generation, and that is fading in and of itself, a lot of people, if they have sons or daughters or grandkids or whatever, you look and they won't even be talking to you. They'll be spacing out, looking at their rapidly communicating to people and checking things out on their cell phone via Facebook or Instagram or whatever they're using. And I've been at business meetings where people just detach from the business meeting and go because they're addicted to the cell phone world of whatever. Now, I know some business meetings with some executives that if you dared to do that, that would be the end of your career. But it's like the new norm. It's people are more there than there are in the real world. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. This is Paul McGuire, but we're going to dive deeper, much deeper than that, because we have truth to unclose, for you to discover, to expose to you that you need to know, so that you can survive, but not just survive victoriously. Not just survive, be an overcomer. mere survival is not, it's great that you're surviving, but mere survival is like treading water. It's not a whole lot of fun. You want to be an overcomer. You want to be more than a conqueror in Christ Jesus. That's your goal, not just mere survival. I mean, survival has to be an initial goal, but from survival, you build upon survival. This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. You are listening to the Paul McGuire Report. This is Paul McGuire. So our world has been morphing into a world of social isolation for decades, especially with the invention of the internet, social media, cell phones, et cetera, et cetera. So this whole thing has kind of been prepped. We've been in a preparation stage for what we're experiencing now. This isn't like some leap into the far blue yonder. This is not like bungee jumping off some ridiculously high bridge. We've been in a quasi-social isolation for decades and decades. Let me give you an example. Some of you can relate to it, some of you won't be able to. For many years, while living in California, Southern California, where we're broadcasting from now, for many years, I remember, actually it goes back before I lived in Southern California, but let's pick it up from Southern California. So shortly after I was married, which was before we came to Southern California, when we moved to Southern California, we would walk around different neighborhoods, et cetera, where we would live. So if we lived in a particular house or whatever, a lot of times we would walk around neighborhoods, when the sun was coming down or when the sun was down, usually because it would be cooler from the heat. So I remember many, many, many times walking down a particular street with my wife, just in a neighborhood where houses are. And what the norm would be, and I would comment about this to her, but what the norm would be you'd look at a house, the blinds and everything would be shut. Most of the lights would be shut off inside the house or in the exterior of the house. Sometimes, walkway lights or something would be on. But usually, from the street point of view, if you looked up at a window or whatever, you would see the fact that a television, you wouldn't necessarily, sometimes you could look up and actually see the television. Most often you would see the reflections and the projections of a light, and often it's a bluish light or whatever. But whatever the color is, you would see in home after home all the lights off except with one room or maybe two with the televisions on. So you'd see the flickering, and it's obvious it was the television screen. There was a giant screen TV in there. By giant screen, I mean, 27 inches and up or whatever. So to 50 inches or whatever. So the point is, though, it was weird because it was like living in a science fiction world, some dystopian novel like Brave New World. There's always a few people walking around at night for like exercise and get out of the house. And yet, as you'd pass by all these windows, home after home after home, they would have the exact same pattern, which was, almost every home, there weren't lights on like people were having any kind of activity, like sitting around talking or whatever. It was always like all the lights were off except for the light of the television and its flickering, hypnotic dance that it does. So the point is that I would comment to my wife, this is like Orwellian and stuff for decades. And I noticed this. And then I noticed that actually I didn't like to go out and walk as much because of the weird lights from the television stuff, there was kind of like a sterile feeling to a lot of places you would walk because of, see, in Southern California, you don't have, especially with the fires and stuff, you don't have, for the most part, lush, thick trees. I mean, you have trees and stuff, but not lush, thick trees like you would have in, let's say, North Carolina or places like that, and different places on the East Coast or places like in Missouri and stuff. So anyway, the point is that people, even within families, learn to social distance before we call it socially distancing. And people would social distance from their neighbors. This is quite common in California. You might say a couple of words to your neighbors or vice versa over a 5-year period. I mean, that's the norm. It's people who live in isolated worlds, hermetically sealed worlds. Okay, so then we have the coronavirus. It's like an entire electronic network, an entire virtual world has been already set up to house all the people that are being quarantined. You may want to pass by this and say, well, it's just a coincidence. All right, maybe it is a coincidence, but it's an interesting coincidence and a coincidence that needs to be observed. Because even if it is just a coincidence, even if just statistically or on the basis of probabilities, it's simply a random, it's coincidental that all the technology for social isolation has, a lot of it has already been developed and people are already using it. People are already socially isolated so that when the necessity for a global quarantine or a quarantine in Western nations or whatever is issued, people are already used to being in their houses and isolated with their social media. So, something to think about, the pattern of it. Also, you had, in terms of political volatility, you had one hearing after another attempting to arrest Trump, to impeach President Trump, etc., going on. And then the minute the last rally to impeachment failed, well, I don't know, what was it, a week later or a couple of weeks later, it was very conspicuous that after the last attempt to impeach Trump failed, then we have a coronavirus epidemic. Just very odd, very odd. And now you have talk about voting by mail or no physical voting. When I hear no voting by mail, when I hear that they're planning to vote by mail, something in me, I don't know if this happens to you. The first time I heard them say, well, we need to vote by mail, everything in me screamed out, yeah, so that's a perfect way to rig the election. I don't believe in the integrity of the electronic voting machines or mail or a physical site unless there are inspection people. The political climate in our nation is so combative right now that there has to be incredible checks and balances on the voting system and the counting system. I mean, you have people who own the controlling stock in these voting machine companies who are very politically active billionaires. Why would you trust their counting? And the temptation to cheat is overwhelming. So if we're going to have any integrity at all in our voting system, it has to be based on, what the Bible would call fair weights and measures, or the scale has to be balanced properly if our society is to survive. But so now we're in houses with social isolation. Now, what's interesting is to observe behavior patterns. And I'm not saying this just to be esoteric and, overly intellectual or whatever. But I've been a people. Let's not call it behavior patterns, because that freaks some people out. Well, why would he sit around? I can see some people saying, why on earth would he sit around observing behavior patterns? And then somebody says to themselves, I do that all day long, and I'm not on some radio program. Yeah, you do it all day long. We all do it. So let's not call it, because it's a little too thick when I say, oh, I sit around observing behavior patterns. It's what I do. In reality, I'm a people watcher. So if you're into sitting around watching people's behavior patterns, which is code for being a snoop, let's be honest, that does reflect a kind of a snoopiness. Notice how carefully I avoided calling myself a snoop, but it does rank of snoopiness. But the point is, let's just call it people watching. I would tell that to people for years. I love to watch people, not for some prurient interest. It's just that it's fascinating to watch the behavior of people. That's, I guess, because I lived a lot in big cities, so there's people to watch. I mean, if I lived in Montana or Idaho or some beautiful forestry, mountainous, area, I don't think I'd be watching people. I'd be watching nature. I'd be just spellbound by the beauty of nature. But when you live in cities or close to cities, which I've done most of my life, like when I'm in Manhattan, and many of you have seen the videotapes of me shooting live from Manhattan, Times Square and Broadway, watching people's behavior is fascinating. Why? It's because people come in patterns and flavors. It's like somebody's, their nervous habits, the quirkiness and stuff. It's not just one person who does that. You could actually categorize it. And if you watch people, you see that you see that all of us are really very similar in some respects. And so, as somebody who's a people watcher, I'm always analyzing. Okay, it's just the way God created my brain. I'm always analyzing. I can't turn that switch off. And I'll give you an example of what I analyze, because that's the analysis really is the study. It's the gaining knowledge of observable events. But there's a purpose in gaining knowledge. And the purpose is, once again, it's not just about a survival, it's about overcoming and being more than a conqueror. That's critical to understand. That's what the Bible teaches. This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit right now, paulmcguire.us. Send the link of this program to somebody who needs to hear it. You are listening to the Paul McGuire Report. This is Paul McGuire. So, being a people watcher. So what I noticed, and you may have noticed this, you may not have noticed this. As I've said many times before, I am not a big fan of the late night comedians, to say the least. Okay? But I know people and interact with people who are. So occasionally I find myself watching something that I wouldn't normally watch. But what I thought was very interesting is that in the last number of weeks, our society has morphed once again. And the vast majority, if not all, of the late night comedians, the people who have these, talk shows like Ellen DeGeneres and so many others who have these talk shows with guests and stuff. Well, and even things like American Idol and The Bachelor and other types of shows, they were scrambling to self-modify in those final segments they aired. But what I noticed is with the late night comedians and so many others, all they did is because technology has come along so far and so fast, with the cell phone, they were all these celebrity TV hosts and late night comedians, they were up and running within a day or two after they were in isolation. Why? Because they all have, like many of you have, whether you realize it or not, the average cell phone, you don't even have to have a high-end cell phone. The average cell phone now has such incredibly high quality for shooting professional video, professional sound, etc., that just about anybody can use social media for whatever. And so you see all these big comedians, etc., big stars being interviewed from home. But this is what happens psychologically. This is what's fascinating. This is what I observed. I learned a principle, a dark principle, a principle I learned about studying scientific mind control, persuasion, hypnosis, mind programming, programming the masses, et cetera, et cetera. I know that's a big container to deal with, but that's how I learned this principle. Okay? And why this principle is important is this principle that I'm about to share with you, this secret principle, is how those who follow evil or selfishness or Satan or whatever, this is a way to control people that is based on the power of evil. So I wouldn't dare, and I would warn you, I wouldn't dare employ it, because I believe in a holy God who holds his children accountable. And if I was to use the power of evil, and full well being conscious of what I was doing, and I was to employ a secret occult principle, I mean, I know that I'm going to stand before a holy God at the judgment seat of Christ, and I'm going to be dealt with for that. See, I fear God, so I wouldn't do that, because the price tag is enormous. You just read the Bible of the people who cross that boundary. Okay, so this is what I want to share with you. It's very, very important to understand this. A number of years ago, in certain circles, a well-known individual, who I don't really want to mention by name at the moment, but this individual was very, very high up in the NSA, National Security Agency, and very, very high up in the U.S. military, and specifically in psyops. And this individual was an open Satanist of the highest ranking. Now, I had some communications with this individual. He obviously knew that my theology, that I believed the Bible literally, which he had a problem with, but, I'm not going to apologize for it. But I read his book on psychological warfare, in which I realized that psychological warfare often applies occult teachings and occult methodology. Why? Because he was deeply involved in the occult. And one principle that he outlined in psychological warfare is a principle that is used by people in public relations, because public relations is a subtle form of psychological warfare. Manipulation of the masses is a form of psychological warfare. And what he pointed out was that, and this is very, very simple stuff. It's so simple that you and I would probably not even think about it much, except that people that are really in what's called the dark arts are into this at a very high level, which is, it's magic is what it is. Magical power. Now, magical power is confusing to most people because they either think of some big Las Vegas performer who packs it out and does these tricks, like they're handcuffed and they're underwater in a giant fish tank or something. These impossible escapes. They're like, I guess you could call them magical performers. The other type of magician is the biblical definition of magicians, and that is one who knows how to traffic in occult powers, magical powers, one who is a high-level witch involved in witchcraft. That could be a male or a female or a Satanist or whatever, or somebody who can perform, quote, supernatural powers. Now, if you read, and I explain this intensively because it's important for you to understand it intensively. I explain this in my 2 volumes. Volume 1 is A Prophecy of the Future of America. Volume 2 is A Prophecy of the Future of America 2016-2017. Ignore the date on it because it's up to the second now in what it deals with. And so in the book, I talk about the fact, especially in A Prophecy of America 2016-2017, Prophecy of the Future of America simply sets it up. But I talk about the fact that, I talk about in Prophecy of the Future of America, the first volume, about the Pharaoh God King system that was built in ancient Babylon, how the secret occult elite ruled the masses through hypnosis or magic or witchcraft or sorcery or whatever you wanted to call it. And that this Babylonian system that was constructed in ancient Babylon at the time of the Tower of Babel is still in existence today. Just walk around Washington, D.C. and look at the symbols. Walk around the Vatican and look at the symbols, like the giant phallic symbols and the womb-like structures. It's kind of like a big hint of what's going on. Okay, so when you read, so for example, in my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, 2016-2017, in the studio, I'm looking for a copy. Fortunately, I know it by heart. Not quite by heart, but in the book, I have a number of chapters that deal with, one, the account of Daniel, who God gives him the ability to supernaturally interpret the dreams of the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? Supernatural miracles performed by Daniel. But when you're reading that chapter, as I teach it to you in my book, when you're reading that chapter, most people just gloss over it. Most people don't stop to realize there's these mentions of all these specific type of occultists, such as sorcerers, people in witchcraft, magicians, clairvoyants, miracle workers, prophets, not biblical prophets, people who predict the future. You see? Now guess what? There's 100 different types of these specialized practitioners of the occult. There's 100 different types of them, at least. No, I shouldn't say there's 100, but there's a large number of different types. But they were amounted to about 100 different people who had different occult talents and abilities. And this was the upper court. These were the top level these weren't just a bunch of clowns and charlatans. These sorcerers and magicians and spell workers and stuff, they together, there were about 100 of them, and they were the highest level advisors for the king of Babylon, because Babylon was built on an occult system of knowledge. And that occult system of knowledge is still active and with us in the world today. In the same way, the story of Joseph and the Pharaoh, what I call the Pharaoh God King system. The Pharaoh God King system, which came out of Babylon, they convinced the masses that they were actually God kings, and therefore the masses, which included the Hebrew slaves who served Pharaoh for 400 years. They served the Pharaoh as a god king, as an act of worship joyously for thousands of years, his slaves did, because they were in a hypnotic trance of mind control built on sorcery and magic. This is Babylonian magic that came from ancient Babylon and was rebooted in ancient Egypt. Now, in this NSA, highest ranking NSA psychological operations director, general, et cetera, we corresponded. He sent me his book on psyops. I read the book on psyops. And he talks about magic. And this is what he talks about, and I want you to pay attention. It's very simple principle. And in fact, many of you probably might even know this principle, but you've never really identified where its power source came from. So this is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us, and we'll be back in just a second. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report on Paul McGuire. So we go back into ancient biblical history. We go back to ancient Babylon at the time of the Tower of Babel. We go back to the Pharaoh God King system, which came after ancient Babylon. And we see that the king of Babylon, when Daniel comes to interpret the king of Babylon's dream about the four great Gentile world empires which are to come in the final global empire, which is the empire of Jesus Christ, which will come at the second coming with the destruction of Antichrist. But we notice that the king of Babylon, because Babylon is an occult magical system, that the king of Babylon has about 100 heavy-duty occult advisors that consist of sorcerers, magicians, clairvoyants, prophets, and all kinds of people who actually work supernatural powers. You say, well, how do we know they're not just phonies and con men and stuff like that? We know they're not phonies, okay? Because the king of Babylon, these were not stupid people. They understood mathematics, architecture, astrology, astronomy, all kinds of things. They were so strict that if somebody was faking it among the occult advisors, if somebody gave a false prediction, a false prophecy, a false magical thing, he would have been instantly killed by the king of Babylon. In fact, the king of Babylon, none of his occult advisors and magicians, etc., could come up with the supernatural interpretation of the dream and vision he had. Okay, none of them could interpret it. That's why they got the prophet Daniel to do it. So there was a threat that the king of Babylon made. He said that he was going to execute and kill every single one of his approximately 100 occult advisors were given the death sentence. So that's why we know there weren't phonies and charlatans among them, because if you proved to be a phony and a charlatan, you would be immediately executed by the king of Babylon. And so Daniel does supernaturally interpret the prophetic dream that the king of Babylon has. And very strangely, Daniel also makes this bold request to the king of Babylon, which is he specifically asks him not to kill all his 100 occult advisors, prophets, astrologers, magicians, sorcerers, and stuff. He specifically says, don't kill them. Now think about that. Most Christians today would say, burn them. He said, don't kill them. On top of that, and I am not suggesting for a moment that any one of you should do this, even those of you who think you have a call in this area, because I'll be very honest with you. Most people that I've met who have told me they have a call in the area of being a spirit-filled Christian and analyzing the occult and dealing with demonology and stuff, the vast majority of them who claim that God called them and supernaturally endowed them to do that, I have found I have not been called by God. And you say, well, how would you know this? Because within a year, they've backslidden. They've gone back into the occult. They've gone back into some heavy-duty immoral lifestyle. And that's because they weren't really called. The demons still had an anchor on them. So this is not the kind of field you tread lightly in. Okay? Either God called you or God didn't. But one of the things we know about God's guidance, the key to God's guidance is that each of us are humble enough to receive it. And so if God says, no, you don't, and there should be confirmation with spiritual leaders that you trust. Okay? I'm not going to name, it has to do with this subject. I'm not going to explain how. But within this subject matter I've been discussing for the last 30 minutes, I called one of my spiritual fathers, probably my main spiritual father was Pastor Jack Hayford, the founder of Church on the Way, to discuss with him certain conversations I had had with certain people. And he was kind enough to take me to lunch, and we talked as we would do from time to time. And I wanted his wisdom. And I told him what I thought the Lord was telling me to do, and he affirmed that was right. But you see, I just didn't go running off half-cocked and dive into heavy-duty occultism and Satanism on a whim. Now, I consulted one of the most respected Christian leaders in the world. You may not have access to that level of decision-making authority, but God does have a man or a woman for you, and make sure it's the right one, who does know the word and is walking with the Lord and will give you a word of whether it's a green light or a red light. Okay, so then the story with Joseph is similar. He's raised up supernaturally by Pharaoh, the God King. He has a supernatural answer to the prophetic dream of 7 years of plenty and 7 years of drought that Pharaoh has. Okay. And God gives him a supernatural plan on how to expand the empire of Egypt, and he becomes the second in command. He becomes practically Pharaoh himself. But know this, that Pharaoh also had, again, approximately 100 heavy-duty witches, Satanists, occult advisors, sorcerers, astrologers, magic workers, all that stuff. So the king of the Pharaoh, God King, also had these occult people. And so what I'm saying is, when God moves a man or a woman into position to possess land for the kingdom of heaven, he supernaturally equips that man or woman with the knowledge of the word, with the anointing, etc., etc. And you better be spiritually warfare trained, or you have no business whatsoever walking in to that level of spiritual conflict. You're going to be taken down and harm your family and everything else. And I'm serious about that. That's not something any of us do without really checking in on the Lord. So what's the point here? Well, the point here is that one of the principles that goes back to ancient Babylon and ancient Egypt, and by the way, before Babylon, there was the Chaldeans, which that was the land. They were heavily involved in black magic and magic. That was the land that Abraham was called out of. And that was completely filled with magic and the occult, that entire nation and society. So what's the point here? The point here is that occult power, supernatural power, is real, but they employ certain techniques, and there is an integration and a synergy and a combination between magical, supernatural powers and psychologically derived powers, because it's a multidimensional approach. It's a multidimensional approach. Just like when you are fighting your spiritual battles in your life, they may have to do with relationships, or marriages, children, finances, health, all of them combined. They may have to do with setbacks due to the coronavirus, unemployment due to the coronavirus. Okay, so you have all of this constitutes the spiritual warfare you're in. So remember this, God did not just call you to survive. God called you to be victorious and to be an overcomer in the last days. I used to work for this guy. He was a high-level executive with a major corporation. This was many, many, many years ago, decades and decades ago. But he had an expression, and he would say, "These are the cards that we have been dealt." I wasn't a card player or anything, but whenever he said that, and he had a particular accent, and it was very interesting. Whenever he said that, we all shut up because this was wisdom from the top executive. And what was he basically what he was telling us when he said, "These are the cards that we have been dealt," and people would laugh, was that he was basically saying, suck it up, grow up, and deal with it. Quit whining about it. That's what he was saying. He was saying, your whining, your complaining is not going to affect or improve your situation, your income. It's going to do nothing of a positive thing for you. So cut it out and be a man or a woman and recognize these are the cards you've been dealt. Now play the cards you've been dealt. Play the hand you've been dealt and quit whining. That's what a lot of Christians need to hear. And you, but I don't believe the Lord has called me to play cards. Then don't play cards. I don't play cards. It's not because I'm some holy guy I can't play cards. I would play cards. I have played cards. The only thing I like to play with is poker. Probably it's the only card game I can remember how to play. You say, well, that's poker. That's sinful. It's only sinful if you let it sinful. If I had a gambling addiction habit, look, some people have a gambling addiction habit. They're addicted to gambling. Well, if I had that, there's no business that I would have any business playing poker. I'm putting myself right in front of temptation that I can't control. Or worse yet, I might be leading somebody who secretly has an addiction to gambling. And, by me being frivolous and not sensitive, I expose this person who's on the verge of backsliding to gambling into that lifestyle. So I don't want to make a joke about it. And it's not, when I talk about that gambling has no grip over me, it's not because I'm so spiritual and super spiritual. This is how it works. We're all children of the fall. We're all descendants of Adam and Eve. We all have a fallen nature. But not all of our fallen natures necessarily express themselves in the same areas as everybody else. In other words, the things that tempt you or you or you or you may not be the things that tempt me, and vice versa. That doesn't make us any better, okay? It just makes us that our fallen nature expresses itself in certain places. Let me give you an example. This is why it's not good to have pride or self-righteousness or be legalistic or judgmental over other people's category of sins just because it's not something that you would do. And also, I want to throw something out to you. And I would only do this when you're ready to handle it. You read the Word. You detox by reading the Word. You cleanse your mind by reading the Word. You pray. You're filled with the Holy Spirit. And then when you feel led to, you ask God to reveal what's in your heart. I would suggest decrementally. And you will discover that any sin, no matter how foul, no matter how abominable, if it's not immediately in your subconscious, it's somewhere deep in your fallen sin nature. In other words, I'm trying to pop a balloon of mythological illusion for you. Jesus Christ did not die an agonizing death on the cross for you and me because we're such, Disneyland kids, squeaky clean, nice people by nature. We are sinners. That means in our sin nature, each one of us has the capacity to murder Christ. Yeah. Any sin that we point our finger at in society and condemn and judge, I'm not saying there isn't a right or wrong. There is a right or wrong. But let's be very careful because sometimes we can be guilty of far worse sins than the sins we're pointing out in God's eyes. Something to think about. That's all. What I'm telling you is that people say, "Well, how can they let?" If people have said to me, how could God, if he was just and good, possibly allow Adolf Hitler into heaven after he killed all the Jews and others in the Holocaust and these other communist dictators that killed hundreds of millions of people? How could God possibly let them into heaven? That's a good question. But apparently he can. If their repentance is genuine and they're truly asking God for forgiveness before they die, when it's not just a game, then God must honor his word. And no matter how horrific the sin, I'll say it again, no matter how horrific the sin, the blood of Jesus Christ will cleanse any individual of all sin by the blood of Jesus Christ, and you could be born again and enter heaven. Now, there's no add-ons to salvation, but this is what I'm driving at. If you and I don't know if I really want to, but if you and I wanted to, I don't know what necessarily would be beneficial. In fact, I don't think it would be. If we were to really look inside and quit, ballooning ourselves into thinking we're such righteous people, I suspect that you would be and I would be absolutely terrified of what abominations and pure selfishness my sin nature and your sin nature is capable of, given the right set of circumstances. See, a lot of us have not committed some really horrific sins. I'm not saying we're all serial killers. Okay, I'm not saying we're all mass murderers. I'm not saying we're all. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is that, let's just talk about this sin. All right. It was common knowledge that the officers that would run the various Nazi concentration camps where they would be killing Jews and others, and they'd be burning them alive or shooting them alive or whatever. It was quite common. You'd have the large Nazi concentration camps where the tortures of Jews and murders of other people and killing, mass slaughter would occur on a regular basis. And then the upper officers, would have nice homes very near the concentration camp, like down the street from it, 2 blocks away, et cetera, et cetera. They lived in very affluent homes, and it was quite common that even though if you actually tried to breathe the air outside a concentration camp, you would most often smell the most putrid stenches, and that was the stench of human flesh burning in a concentration camp fire in an oven. It was a hideous smell. But for whatever reason, these Nazi officers could compartmentalize and not smell that smell inside their very affluent middle-class houses that were given to them. I'd say they're more upper-class, middle-class houses, kind of mini estates. And they would have classical musicians play the finest of classical music. They would verbally discuss Shakespeare and philosophy. They would eat a very fine cuisine. So on every hand, if you were to be sitting down, it wasn't just the military generals and the officers. It would be the mayor and the powers that be. And it was said over and over again what absolute gentlemen these Nazi officers were, how schooled they were in philosophy and the romantics and their culinary arts, their cooking, their cuisine, their culture, their appreciation for art. Most of all, their appreciation for the finest of classical music, the appreciation of distinct wines. In other words, what was said about these Nazi officers and that many of these Nazis of wealth and power, they had this strange schizophrenia. On one hand, they could be these butchers and sadists and murderers in the concentration camps. Yet, if they walked 2 blocks away from the concentration camps, it was like they could mentally shut that out, and they were the most gentlemanly, aristocratic, virtuous, intelligent, sensitive, compassionate people. People would just praise them for their sensitivity, their people skills, how polite they were. Are you getting a picture of the dichotomy in the Nazi lives, in their wives and children? They were the butchers of Auschwitz and stuff. You have Mengele who would torture people in freezing ice water for hours while they were naked, or inject their eyeballs with dye. And what Mengele, who was an MK Ultra mind control doctor as well as sadist, I won't even describe to you what he did to little boys, girls, women, adults, men, and stuff by the tens of thousands, what he would do to them under the false label of medical experimentation, which is nothing than the most sadistic, horrific, brutal, painful mutilation and cutting off and torturing of the human body imaginable. I can't even, what I know, I don't even want to repeat. It's just so vile. It's right out of hell. And to think, nobody can prove this for sure. I've done lots of research. People say they can prove it. I don't know if you, I'm just going to come out and say, I don't think you can prove it. I suspect it, but I don't think I can prove it. Remember that the United States government, via Operation Paperclip at the end of World War II, illegally smuggled into the United States over 10,000 Nazi rocket scientists, mind control scientists, and biological warfare scientists. Our government smuggled in under Operation Paperclip 10,000 of these high-level Nazi mind control and rocket scientists. And they gave them the jobs of heads of think tanks and laboratories all across the country. Wernher von Braun, one of the most famous, he was given the job of being the founder and creator of NASA. He worked closely with Walt Disney. You can figure out that one day when you're ready to open up the box. When you're ready to open up go down the rabbit hole to the relationship between Walt Disney, NASA, and Wernher von Braun. We'll talk about it. But I don't think a lot of you are ready for that, so I'm not going to go there. So the point is that they were known as gentle people, but they were savage monsters. What Mengele did in terms of human torture, because remember the formula for all brainwashing and mind control is pain, drugs, and hypnosis. Okay, so now where I'm trying to bring us to is that this guy who was one of the highest, I think he was the second highest ranking man in the NSA, in the psychological warfare department. I mean, really high up. And basically in his book, he talked about the relationship between occult magic and theater and propaganda and symbolism and props. And so what he did, because this man is a genius, when I read his book, I said, my God, I wish Christians were this smart. His knowledge of literary works, philosophy, psychology, science was just off the charts, and yet he was a Satanist. Okay, so what he basically said is remember, let's use this as a case in point, because it's a repetitive case. Okay, for those of you that have seen the black and white movies, the pictures, the photographs, the videos of the horrible Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler's making speeches and driving around Germany and leading his troops with swastikas, you notice that Hitler would be standing up on this giant platform, kind of like a Greek god. There would be these massive Roman columns behind him, very theatrical, and these massive banners of black, white, and red swastika flags draping down this massive outdoor theater. And then you would have soldiers and people lined up for miles in rows. And so what would happen to the average person psychologically when you walk into a super stadium and there's a highly charismatic individual standing on the stage and all the music is being directed towards the individual and the theatrics is all done to make the individual appear godlike. The sound system has been checked to make Hitler's voice sound like a god. The music to make Hitler sound like a god. The lighting as he was bathed in lights. The whole thing is like a super Broadway show or U.S. Olympics halftime ceremony. The whole idea is to use the technology of lighting, painting, color, sound, platforming somebody high up, giant banners, visually standing there with like 100,000 people around you who are all chanting Sig Heil, Sig Heil. What you're doing there is you're putting together a cake mix of a giant mind control event. The human consciousness, the human brain, when a person is saturated in subliminal messages of ethereal godlike music, marching band, giant swastika banners, giant Roman columns like a giant Roman fortress, spotlights, illuminating Hitler, who's wearing a tailor-made SS outfit, a soldier outfit. His warm-up men, the Nazi generals, the choirs and singers, and the way he would come in a parade of cars, all limousines. So you got to picture this. You're in a very elegant, powerful area of Germany. Everything has a symbolic meaning. So now Hitler, Dr. Timothy Leary called this process set and setting. Psychologists have used this since Babylon. When you're going to put somebody in a trance, which a sorcerer could do in ancient Babylon, one of the ways you put somebody in a trance is you suspend their current modality of thinking. So when you take the average person, and back then people were not that sophisticated about technology, and Hitler got up there, and Hitler was trained by the occult societies that put him in power, like the Vril Society, the Thule Society, and other secret occult societies. Hitler was trained on how to speak with hypnotic control authority. Hitler was trained on how to speak while at the same time channeling eloquently the demon and demons that possessed him. No. Hitler was not foaming at the mouth, acting like a nut. He got fervent, but it was controlled fervency. And so what this guy said in his book on psyops was that psyops is like magic. It's like theater. You have to you use illusion, you use lighting, you use costuming, you use clothing, you use hair, you use microphones, you use giant pedestals and platforms and music, and you use all the arts. All the theatrical arts, all the lighting, cinematography arts, all the body language arts, all the way of projecting arts, the rhythm of your voice arts. You use all of this. You train yourself in all of this so that you can put the masses, when they would gather to hear Hitler speak, they were in a trance-like state. They would go, Sig Heil, Sig Heil, Sig Heil. And I cast a spell over them. But not only that, his ability to bond with them was supernatural. It was like, wow. And that is what this head of the NSA, who was obviously the head of the NSA, who was corresponding with me after reading my book, was also, I don't know if Anton LaVey, the former head of the Satanic Church, is still alive, but he was second in command to Anton LaVey of the Satanic Church, and he was an open Satanist of the highest rank in the U.S. military. What he said is that all these theatrical things and magical things are part of the multidimensional approach of, he said, the goal is mass hypnosis casting a spell on masses of people. And therefore, in order to do that, you utilize technology, music, lighting, architecture, putting up people on high platforms, the way they dress, the way they're lit, the sound system, the choir. Everything is done to build up these people like, in this case, Hitler, like gods. And so the purpose of this in psyops and propaganda and in the occult and magic, because it's all one system. The purpose of this is then the people will subconsciously, without realizing it, their subconscious minds, not their conscious minds, their subconscious minds will confer upon Hitler or anybody else who's staged in that manner. They'll confer upon him a messianic or godlike power. They'll follow him like a messiah or a god, which the German people did towards Adolf Hitler. And this goes back to Babylon, Mystery Babylon. It goes back to the Pharaoh God King system in Egypt, etc., etc. This is how modern mind control works. So you see the same thing being done with the celebrities in Hollywood. You know, it's a minor scale, but they're platformed. That's why they're called stars, idols. They receive this golden statue. It's like an idolatrous god. The entire Academy Award ceremonies is its third to be entertaining. Its primary thing is to establish this godlike relationship between the masses of America who are being programmed to worship the movie stars, the rock stars, the pop stars, like gods and goddesses and idols. And the entire, whether it's the Grammys or the Academy Awards, the lighting, the statues, these one superstar conferring power on another superstar, the symbols and everything else, it's a giant magical theatrical event that uses a psychological mechanism which releases the occult power. Many of these people are involved in the occult. It releases an occult power where the audience subconsciously confers upon the stars or their idols a godlike power. But it's all a psychological illusion. A psychological illusion. I'll give you two examples. First of all, some people consider me famous. I don't consider myself famous. I'm famous within a certain groups of subcultures. However, when I was on the radio with the Paul McGuire show a decade and a half ago or whatever, I remember speaking at a large mega church of about 5,000, 6,000 people. When I left from speaking, I would have a lot of, quote, fans of the Paul McGuire show because it was on AM and FM all over California and every major market in the United States. It was a daily drive time show, you could call in. It was 3 to 4 hours daily drive time, Monday through Friday, and also played on reruns on the weekends. So the program had a lot of power and wallop. And most people would meet you and they'd be impressed to meet the face behind the voice and stuff. But every once in a while, you get somebody who they were sincere, and I'm not putting them down. It's just, maybe it's because they would listen all the time. And see, when you listen all the time to a voice like mine, or a voice for evil, or a voice for good, or whatever, for some people, for many people, you just say, okay, this is just a guy, Paul McGuire, he's a regular guy sitting behind a microphone. And that's the truth. But some people, because they hear you in so many environments, on the cell phone, in their car, while they're jogging, subconsciously you become, not everybody, but the minority, but subconsciously you become larger than life to them. Almost like a rock star or something. And it's not that you're looking for it, it's just I remember Pat Robertson talking about this years ago. Pat Robertson was on my program a number of times. He was a huge supporter of my ministry and vigorously defended it. But I remember Pat Robertson on the 700 Club talking about this psychological dynamic years before I ever got into the media. And this is what Pat Robertson said. It was very, very interesting. He said, there's Pat Robertson, 700 Club, CBN, all that stuff. Pat Robertson said, there's just an unusual psychological phenomenon with being on television. He said, when you're on television, like I am or other people are, people see you day after day after day. But it's kind of like a one-way relationship. They're seeing you. They're getting to know all about you. So what happens, Pat Robertson said, is over time, they get to feel like they totally know you in the sense that they kind of own you, that you're their friend. And it's an illusion, but that's what happens to a lot of people because they're spending so much time with you. He said, the problem is, though, when you go out in real life and one of those individuals who's developed a relationship with you happens to see you in real life, let's say at a conference or a church where you're speaking or whatever, and they run up to you, Pat Robertson said, what happens is that they also subconsciously, without realizing it, expect you to know them just as much as they know all about you, and for you to be just as excited about them that you know their name, their habits, their husband, their wife, everything about them, and that you and them are the closest of buddies. And he said it's very sad, and it wasn't an ego thing with him. He said it's very sad, though. He said because it's really not fair. He said because we on TV, we really aren't watching their lives and learning all about them. We're talking to we can feel them spiritually, but we're not locking eyes with them for the most part. And he said, so what happens is they don't when they meet you, they don't recognize that you don't know them the way they know you, which is they know a lot about you. They may be listening to you for years. And so he said, as a true man of God should, he said, so I have tried to teach myself this. I've tried to school myself in this and really be sensitive to this, he said, because even though I may not know all about them because I'm not watching them via television, they're watching about me. He said, I've tried to train myself to be very sensitive to where they're at psychologically and to do everything I can to affirm them and love them and honor that relationship. And that stuck long before I was well known or whatever. That stuck in my mind. And it was, see how a passing comment of somebody who walking with God, a passing comment from somebody's life who walks with God can just change your whole life. So that opened up my soul because it prepared me to receive the truth I'm sharing with you now. So I'll give you an example of what happened. And this kind of thing happens. It happens more than you think it would. It's not the norm, but it does happen. It depends on the individual. So this girl walks out, and her husband in the auditorium where I just spoke, and there's people from the radio station sitting there at desks, and to meet the public, and I'll sign books or whatever. So this girl goes, "This is Paul McGuire," and then she totally freaks out, and she keeps jumping up and down, and "Oh, you're Paul McGuire! I can't believe you're Paul McGuire!" Okay. And it gets louder and louder and louder. Now, don't think I'm an egomaniac. I'm not. I've experienced this before, okay? Most often it goes on, "Oh, this is Paul McGuire. I can't believe I met Paul McGuire. I'm so excited. Oh, honey, it's Paul McGuire." Okay. Usually that's about how long it lasts. Not much longer and sometimes shorter. It's not that, it's a short kind of thing. Do you understand? Okay. So what was beginning to disturb me about this particular girl, I didn't think she was evil or anything. It's just that it wasn't the normal kind of length and then it drops and gets to normal, and we take a picture together or whatever. It kept going on. And then it went on to like 5 minutes and 10 minutes, and then after about 10 minutes, it was headed up into the full. And then I began to get concerned because, I don't call myself a psychologist or something. And I said, this girl doesn't realize it, but she's become somewhat hysterical. And it reminded me of when they actually paid these girls to shriek and pass out at the first Beatles concert in the United States, which was in Queens. I forgot the Met Stadium. I think it was Met Stadium. Yeah. And girls were secretly paid by the Beatles promoters to shriek and pass out on camera. Many of you saw that. Okay, well, this girl was acting like that, but nobody was paying her. So this was getting weird because she was really getting uncontrollable, and most people would have thought it was just genuine excitement. But I began to realize that this was not going in a good place. Okay, I wasn't concerned about any danger, but what I did is just instinctively I got up because I was there to sign a book or whatever. I got up from my seat real quickly and as unnoticeably as I possibly could. I just, because her husband was now standing there and her daughter, and I just very subtly moved behind her and put my arm around her shoulder, which I often do when people want a picture taken. Okay. And what that did was it interrupted the hysteria. And then before she could talk or anything, I sensed the hysteria was interrupted. So I immediately began to talk and say, hey, why don't we get a picture of you and your husband and everything? And okay, so then one of the staff takes a picture and my arm is around her husband, my arm's around her and their daughter or something. And so the point is distracting her mind from the hysteria snapped her back into normal. Now, that's happened before. People go, well, people are acting like you're a rock star. Okay, so the point of that's based on certain elements happening. When we always see people on a stage or on TV or something, sometimes subconsciously we confer powers or status upon them, which they shouldn't be given because it's just an illusion. The entire mainstream media runs on that. So this guy talked about the occult principle of, I think he called it staging or something, and staging is still used in theater. That when you have the right amount of lights, when you put somebody up on a platform, when you have certain kinds of music playing, when you have a sizable audience cheering and positively, emotionally reinforcing the speaker, you are creating all the separate individual events that go into the big cake mix of manufacturing like a celebrity consciousness, which is Hollywood's built on that. But it's an illusion. It's all an illusion. But the mind, since you and I have been young, many people feel like this. Many people feel that the only thing that's really real is what they see on television. And many people have a transcendental experience of some kind or another when they finally they come to Hollywood or New York or whatever, go on The Bachelor or whatever, and they finally have an experience to not be in the audience and be shot on camera, but to stand with the stars or the performers or to be backstage. It's at that moment they feel like they've really seen reality. It's a very, very, very powerful, very, very supernatural and psychological transcendence that's real. Now, I understand this personally long, long, long before I got into the media and stuff, or excuse me, when I just began to get into it. This is what happened to me. I don't remember where it was, but I've been on a lot of TV shows, radio shows, etc. And this was one of the first big professional appearances I made. Probably a big news channel or something. And I'd been on smaller media. So when I went into the building, when I went through the back rooms, when I went into the green room where you wait, when I was set up to be lit, put in a chair and stuff. So now I'm sitting in a position where I'm either talking to the host of the program via a television set, and that host is in Manhattan. I'm in the Southern California studios. Or sometimes I'm an actual set with, 100, 200 people in the audience, and there's two chairs, and we're physically face to face. But I've walked out with him from behind the chambers where the staff is or whatever. Okay, so this happened to me many, many, many decades ago. And what happened to me was subconsciously, the thoughts passed through my mind that, Paul, you're finally looking at real reality, and you're no longer looking at the illusion. In other words, I found my mind automatically going through that process where I'm saying, wait a minute, this is real reality. What's going on behind the camera? How these people are acting behind the camera is real reality. And the audience is not real reality. And what's outside is the manipulation of reality. It's hard to describe because this was not a series of intellectual thoughts I asked myself. It was kind of like a flash of insight. I felt like, in a sense, for the first time in my life, I pierced this invisible wall and got to go behind the illusion into the land of the illusion manufacturers. I know this sounds a little weird, but I've talked to so many people or heard so many people who are not even in the media, who had similar experiences for whatever reason when they watched a movie being made, a TV show being made, or were in the audience or whatever. They had that experience. And the experience comes from this. Starting at the earliest ages, for me, it was black and white TV when I was a little kid. You're watching all those shows, and you're seeing characters and stuff, and you're seeing your reality, but there's something very more magical about the reality aimed at kids coming from black and white TV or color TV. There's something really magical, especially in movies, about that kind of reality. And as you have this instinctual need as a little child to go through the curtains and see the Wizard of Oz, the fake, hiding behind this manufactured reality. It's something that I think is in our human nature. Okay, so in Jackson Heights, Queens, I think every day, I believe, a local station. When I say a local station, it's probably a Channel 9 or a 5 or something. But local stations in New York City were like 28 million people were watching. So every day, weekday, Bozo the Clown came on, which was a guy dressed up in a clown suit. And, it was a lighthearted comedy show with geared towards really young kids, okay? So I watched it every day. And then at the end, some woman got up there with a fake mirror thing. And she would just randomly name out popular names for boys and girls. Of course, and when you heard that, you thought, oh, she's really seeing me through the magic mirror. But she was randomly reading off names. So I remember I get invited to a birthday party. I may have shared this with you, but it's worth repeating again. One of the mothers of one of my friends arranged a birthday party. I never heard of this. I didn't know that it was possible that for a birthday party, if a mother or whatever signed up enough kids, and I guess they had to pay a ticket price or whatever, as part of the birthday celebration, you could bring a group of your kids' friends all in one grouping to be part of the Bozo the Clown audience. Now, when I heard this, I was sky high, to actually to see Bozo the Clown and to be in the Bozo the Clown audience. This was heavy duty stuff. So somehow we took different cars, and it turns out that the Bozo the Clown show, I believe it was CBS, forgive me. And it was in the CBS building in Manhattan. And for this giant show, it was somewhat modest of a studio and stuff. But Bozo the Clown came out. Everybody's going hysterical. He's giving out candy. He's shaking kids' hands, kissing them on the. This is a more innocent time. And then he's got his big plastic outfit with his big plastic nose and stuff, the red nose. The Bozo the Clown kisses me on the nose. And it was innocent at that time. And I was high as a kite because I had actually had an interaction with Bozo the Clown, who was as real to me as a good friend, like a virtual world. So what I'm saying is media, no matter what age you are, and different strokes for different folks. I mean, I could meet all kinds of people that people consider superstars, and I would just yawn. You're probably the same way. In order for us to be enamored by somebody or an individual or whatever, they have to be in an arena or a platform that we have interest in or respect. Okay, the point of this is when you give people this power, supernaturally and psychologically, they have almost godlike status in our media because of sports, film, television, politics, or so many other things. And just projecting the right image in the right set and setting, you have halfway. What you've done to the average person, subconsciously or consciously, when you bring them into actual, for the first time, proximity with some superstar that they kind of worship or some show that they're huge fans of, what you're doing is the first time these people enter the physical reality of being in the presence of their screen idols, their TV show stars or whatever, what happens to the average person, not all the time, as they leave the land of watching their movie star, TV star friends, music friends, as they stop watching the cell phone and internet, and they start watching the go into a real studio, real auditorium, where they'll actually really be able to physically see these stars and stuff. What happens to the human mind is the switching of realities, the illusion dissipating, causes your average person's head to spin somewhat. Their thoughts are spinning, which is a fancy term for cognitive dissonance. They disconnect because their reality is spinning. When your reality is spinning and you're in that disconnect phase or mode in your mind, what happens is you are now vulnerable to be locked into a hypnotic state. And so the magical accoutrements, the lighting, the staging, the music, people looking larger than life, and now for the first time, being in this inner chamber, it's like a religious experience. And you get to meet that person or whatever, you're solidifying and reinforcing your perception that they're larger than life, that somehow they're wiser than you. I'm talking about on a primal level, not a rational level. They're wiser, they're more logical, that what they must know secrets and answers that you don't know. They know what life is really all about that you don't know. See, there's a magical interaction and a magical transference. Now, this isn't just psychological meandering. This is what this guy who wrote PsyOps was talking about. He was talking about one of the major game plans in PsyOps is to create a theatrical, podium-like, larger-than-life setting, whether it's in the psychological reality or a physical reality. The use of clothing, the use of light, the use of sound, the use of voice, the projection of voice, etc., can give people a godlike status. And then it's possible that mass hysteria can be subdued. You have a mass programming. You can and that's why Hitler took over Germany. first made them spellbound. The point is, we don't want to allow the media to do that to us, whether that spellbinding is in the selling of, principles, ideas, beliefs, that can be described in one sentence. These are not the new Ten Commandments. These aren't gods we're listening to. They're flawed people, and we need to see them as they really are. If we're magnifying them, kind of like Joshua and Caleb did with the giants, if we're magnifying them, we're distorting our perception. But the root of the distortion of perception is the decision to become idolatrous in our looking at them. We're becoming idolatrous. We're making them gods. And they're not gods. They're terribly flawed. And that's being generous. This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. We'll be back in just a second. What's very interesting is that as all these superstar comedians and superstar politicians and superstar cultural leaders and on and on and on, sports figures, we're seeing so many of them being interviewed from their houses or what they pretend are their houses or whatever. And what's interesting is you're looking at now hundreds and thousands of people that you may see in the media on a regular basis. But most of these people are being propped up by these magical theatrical sets, the logos of the massive corporations they work for, the millions and millions of dollar news sets, the lighting, the guests, all the magic that goes into making a set for a late night comedian or a news anchor celebrity or all these other things. They're usually coming from studios with lighting and all kinds of teams that are pumping millions and millions and millions of dollars to make sure that your perception of the people that they're showing you on TV is almost godlike. Now, with the coronavirus, everybody's shooting at home with very close to average equipment, average lights, average cameras, average cell phones. Yeah, the big people have the producers who come in and enhance quite a bit their home. Their so-called home studios are secretly relit, rewired for sound and everything else because they had pros come in a couple of days and redo it. But still, they're not being propped up by their super multi-millions of dollar sets. And so they also don't have access to the same level of makeup and lighting and wardrobe and various assistants that make sure your presentation is really over the top. They don't have access to that for the most part. So what you're seeing is, on a visual basis, you're seeing that all these movie stars, all these big shots, all these comedians, all these stars, you're seeing them in a subordinary, below ordinary perception because the technical excellence that they normally have is not available to them when they're being in social isolation. So, and same with their makeup and hair and stuff. So in a sense, you're seeing them not at their worst, but you're seeing them in a lower light. You're seeing them in a more human, more real, more everyday guy, everyday girl kind of camera setting. So it's very subtle. Most people won't realize it. It's very subtle, but your mind has to do a recalibration because subconsciously you're sitting there and you're watching all these famous people that you know who are famous. Usually they're coming to you from some palatial set, but now you see them crammed into their living room, their kitchen, and it's not all that palatial, and the lighting's not perfect, and the wardrobe and hair are less than perfect. and they're looking more and more like the average guy and the average girl putting up their Facebook videos or Facebook pictures or whatever. They're looking like average people. Now you say, well, what does that have to mean? What's happening is there's been an unintended consequence to this entire thing, one that was not calculated out, and a powerful unintended consequence. And here it is. By having all the stars in social isolation and forcing them to use vastly inferior equipment and hair and makeup and lighting and presentation, you have minimized them, not intentionally, but you have removed their superstar status by hindering the physical projection and the physical wow factor. You've brought them down in what they're generating physically, etc., to below average. So now we're looking at people who are coming at us below average in dress, below average in makeup, below average in set, below average in jokes, below average in all kinds of things. They've lost their stars, that have lost their luster. In other words, what's happening subconsciously is the average person is making the mental calculation that, hey, take away their big fancy sets and their giant staffs, these people look just like me and my friends. There's no difference between them and me. They're not better than me. They're not so quick. And then things like people start to notice the jokes aren't funny. Why? Because these people that they thought were funny all these years really aren't that funny. They're not funny. They're funny when they have their teams of joke writers writing the jokes, but when they're doing it impromptu from home, they're not being funny. So what I'm telling you is I believe this will never be discussed out in the open. These are one of the taboos that our society doesn't allow us to talk about. But I believe what's happening is there's been a massive paradigm shift, a massive calibration in the way people view celebrity, power, political power, star power, whatever you want to call it. There's been a tremendous change in view, and I believe there's been like a super download education of the fact that these people that we confer such power upon are really below average once you take away all the props. I think there's been a fresh recognition of that. So, how does that transfer into everyday life? Huxley and other advocates of the scientific dictatorship all understood that as long as a society or a totalitarian nation projected the image, the psychology of power and being in control, et cetera, they could rule very, very easily because they were ruling psychologically. The key is to have people to continue to believe illusion. Now, questions about the illusion, that reality is cracking. There are a lot of proposals for solutions to this coronavirus. Nobody's happy with these solutions. These solutions appear to be part of a very dark, hidden agenda, and people are starting to see through that. So, the good thing about all of this is that the more people there are that are starting to awaken from this illusion of this present world system, the more people there will be that are hungry for truth. And that's our job. Our job is to spread the truth far and wide through every social media, through every internet, through every cell phone, through every conference, through every book, every means of communication, written, video, audio, and to get truth out there, to get people thinking, to get people questioning, to get people to reconsider things like Jesus Christ. In order that, we need your 100% commitment and support. So thank you for being an intercessory prayer warrior. We need your prayers constantly. Thank you for spreading these messages far and wide, the links far and wide. And thank you for asking God how much you can give financially or what your donation should be. And we thank God for your obedience to the Lord Jesus Christ in that area. God bless you. This is Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us.